to the All right, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming to our first Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition Lunch and Learn on topics related to the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. Of course, we're super excited to have passed this bill last year, but now we've given ourselves even more work to do, and we need to work on implementation of this bill. So we asked members of the coalition the topics that they wanted to hear more about. And the very first one, and also kind of the most timely in terms of where we are in the schedule, is renewable energy procurement and the Illinois Power Agency. So we are very delighted to have the extremely brilliant and talented Melena Hessel, who is going to walk us through how this process works. And we're going to learn more about it. We are recording this so we can share it with other folks later. So if you do have questions during this, put this in the chat, but I will be strategically interrupting Melena because she won't be able to pay attention to the chat, but feel free to put your question in there and then I will read it to her and we'll get going. So Melena, you are in charge.
Great. Hi, everyone. Nice to, well, not see most of you, but know that you're here with me. Today's Lunch and Learn, as Jen said, is about the Illinois Power Agency's programs and procurements, but specifically it's renewable programs and procurements. That's what I'll be focusing on. You're with me, I don't know if we're going to take the full hour, but you're with me for a while. And Jen told me this is intermediate level. So I hope you guys are prepared for some wonkiness. And if I dive too wonky, get too boring, please tell Jen in the chat to nudge me along or just speak up. I would welcome more voices today, as I'm sure would everybody else. Nobody wants to listen to just me for that long. So I'm going to introduce myself, and then, as I said, for those of you who are on the very start, I'll also be asking about topics you're interested in me covering. So I want to briefly introduce myself and my organization. So my name is Melena. Jen already introduced me, Melena Hessel. I'm a senior policy advocate at the Environmental Law and Policy Center. And just a second about ELPC, in case you don't know us. We are a non-profit public interest environmental advocacy group. Often that means environmental lawyers. I am not a lawyer. I'm a public policy person. I'm an environmental policy person. And I work on our clean energy team covering, among other things, renewables in Illinois. So today, I'm here to talk about the IPA's renewables programs and procurements generally. So I'll start off talking about the IPA, the Illinois Power Agency. What is it? I'll remind folks of what our renewable portfolio standard is, since that's where the renewables programs and procurements flow from. I'll touch on what other IPA procurements exist. I'm not going to be explaining them, but I know some of you are interested in them or just would be curious to be aware about them. I'm gonna touch on what a REC, a renewable energy credit, is briefly, since that's so central to all of our renewables programs and procurements. And then I'm actually going to get into the meat. I'm going to get into what those renewables programs and procurements are post CEJA. So that's like one bullet on this list, but it's a lot of my slides, just warning you. Then I was planning to touch on the Renewables Plan, which is sort of the controlling document for how all this renewable stuff goes and is in the process of being updated right now. So that's what I've prepared slides to talk to you about, but I did want to open it up right now to ask about what else any of you were hoping to hear about. And I'd love for folks just to unmute and shout it out, or if you put something in the chat, I think Jen is happy to convey that to me as well.
Anything you've reviewed on the diversity, equity, and inclusion portions would be great, Melena.
Got it. Thanks, Dawn. And I will note that Jen and I the IPA's plan came out last week. Jen and I tried to schedule this later in the month so that I'd have a better chance of reviewing, and it didn't work out. So I am not done my detailed review of the IPA's renewables. But I have DEI written down. Anything else, guys?
I don't see anything in the chat, but folks, if anybody wants to take themselves off mute real quick and suggest any ideas, I'm watching the chat too. But yeah, I think this is great.
Great. Okay. So with that, the IPA, I put the IPA's mission up on this slide. So the IPA, and we have people from the IPA, Illinois People's Action, on this call. The IPA stands for the Illinois Power Agency, and I will be referring to them by that acronym throughout the rest of this presentation, probably. So IPA equals Illinois Power Agency. Critically for this webinar, they're the agency that runs all the renewables programs and procurements, but they do a lot of other stuff too. They were established in 2007 when Illinois stopped having the utilities buy all the energy for us in order to sort of provide a neutral purchaser of energy for Illinois residents and small businesses. They also do a fair amount with our programs to support and ensure we have zero carbon energy in Illinois, and some programs related to coal as well. But I think, you know, a huge chunk of what they do is that energy procurement as well as the renewables procurement, which is why they're the agency that matter for renewables programs and procurement. The other thing that you should know going in to talking about the renewables programs and procurements is a little bit about Illinois' Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS. An RPS is a requirement, and this exists in multiple states or across multiple utility territories. An RPS is a requirement that a portion of energy come from renewable resources. In Illinois, that's been a portion that's been ratcheting up over time since the mid-2000s. And you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, the portion of energy required to come from renewables on a going forward basis. Starting right now, we're required to have 19% of our energy from renewables. Spoiler, we're not hitting that yet. But that's the goal that's in the law. Our renewable portfolio standard has these requirements for percentages, a percent of electricity to come from renewables. It also has targets for the way that we hit those RPS percentages to come from the development of new renewable resources. The idea being that, you know, what really leads to the transition to clean energy is ultimately displacing polluting resources with clean renewable energy. And so what we really want in order to hit these goals is to build more renewables. And so that's, I think, a big reason that we have these new build targets as part of our renewable portfolio standard in Illinois. I mentioned that we're not hitting these goals yet. I'm not going to go into the RPS history in detail, but I'll note that it wasn't working to hit the goals for a long time, and it was only being applied to a subset of our energy use in Illinois for a long time. So as a result of both only being applied to a subset and parts of it not working, we're sort of behind in meeting these goals. And part of what I think these new build targets are designed to do in seeking a certain amount of new build by 2030 is to help ratchet us up so that by 2030 we are meeting these goals.
So Melena, I had a question about table 3-3 and if it's in dollars.
So that table, that's a good question. So those tables are in recs or megawatt hours. And ultimately, so megawatt hours is a unit of electricity. What you can see sort of in the bottom right-hand side of the screen is a goal of 45 million megawatt hours or recs from renewables by 2030. So that's an annual amount. And to help like understand what that means, I'd say that, so we estimate that about, to get to our sort of 40% by 2030 renewables goal, we'll need, that means that about 49 million megawatt hours, 49 million recs need to be procured every year. So that 45 million number, that million annual rec number, is pretty close to our 40% by 2030 goal. That's pretty close to getting at least ComEd, Ameren, and Mid-American customers, which are who the RPS really applies to 40% renewable by 2030. And I'll talk more about RECs in a minute, but did that clarify the issue a little for folks, the question a little for folks? The other thing I'll say is that I think the estimates I've seen are that these new build targets are going to lead to roughly 14 gigawatts of new solar and about 5 gigawatts of new wind getting developed in and around Illinois. So, a lot of new renewables. I also just wanted to briefly touch on the non-RPS IPA procurements that happen. I already mentioned that the IPA was created to buy energy and capacity for Illinois residents and small businesses in particular. So that's a big part of what they do. I won't be talking about that today. They also run the zero emission credit and carbon mitigation credit procurements rather, that primarily buy credits from, or exclusively buy credits from nuclear facilities in Illinois. They'll also be running the new half of the new coal to solar program in Illinois. So CEJA created a sort of dual program to support the development of solar plus storage at old coal generating plants. A portion of that program will be run through the IPA via the procurement of RECs, but another portion will also be run through DCEO through grants. So I'm not going to be covering that today as it's outside of the RPS. All of the RECs can count towards the RPS, but that's a whole other universe of stuff they touch on. And if you're interested in looking at any more information on any of these procurements, I would go to the IPA's procurement website, which I've included on this slide. Then I wanted to just remind folks about what is a REC. I've been talking about RECs. I assume that some of you have some idea of what they are. I also know they're sort of difficult concepts. So REC stands for Renewable Energy Credit or Renewable Energy Certificate. And these are a REC represents the environmental attributes. The renewableness is my made up word of renewable energy, and all sort of the additional environmental benefits that a renewable energy brings versus traditional polluting resources. We need our RECs, or they were, at least they were created because there's really no good way, once you plop an electron on the grid from solar or from wind, there's no good way to say, oh, I'm using that wind electron versus I'm using that coal electron. Everything goes onto the grid, it all gets mixed. There's no way to track who's using renewable energy and who's not when you're putting energy on a grid instead of just using it immediately on site where it's generated. So these tradable credits are the mechanism we use in the US to track and sort of legally certify that we are renewable. If you ever see, you know, Amazon or somebody say, hey, I'm using 100% renewable energy, that means that they have generated or bought RECs for the entirety of the energy they're using. And that also makes them really useful when we're doing something like an RPS, that they're what we need to procure and retire the RECs for our commensurate with the percentage of load we're trying to procure renewable in order to be renewable. And therefore, at least in Illinois, our renewables procurements and programs are focused on the RECs, on buying the RECs from these resources and then retiring them to hit our RPS targets. Does anyone have any questions on that, or does anyone want to offer a really good analogy for what is a REC that they've heard?
Okay, so there's a couple of questions in the chat, Melena. So there was can you talk about how to best determine the additionality of RECs? Like, how could a municipality guarantee that our REC purchasing actually contributes new renewable energy sources to the grid? This is from Tess from Northbrook.
Why don't you give me all the questions? There was additionality. Are there any other ones?
That was it. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good question. You know, because these are tradable credits, you know, a credit can get generated 10 years ago. And if nobody retires it, then theoretically someone could buy it today and pair it with the electricity they're using to be renewable. I think that, you know, I think that a lot of the sort of requirements on GHG, on greenhouse gas tracking and whatnot are savvy to that risk and can put requirements in place to address that. A lot of the tracking groups make sure that they have time limits on when they'll sort of consider a REC as eligible. I think for a municipality, if you're procuring RECs on your own, I just think it's relevant to ask, you know, understand where the RECs are coming from. And sometimes you won't be able to know upfront, depending on how you procure it. It's great if you can know in advance. I know that there are contracts out there that with like alternative retail electric suppliers that don't always commit up front. It is better to commit up front, but I think that you can also like just make sure that as someone's procuring RECs on your behalf, you get the information about, okay, what resource is it? Is it wind? Is it solar? Is it something else? When was it generated? That sort of thing, so that you're making sure that you're making those commitments. The Illinois RPS has a requirement for RECs to come from new resources, which is defined as resources built after 2017. So that if you're, there are sort of requirements in the Illinois RPS to ensure that we'll get to that additionality.
So there was just to be clear, there's a question. Are RECs valued at the cost of 1 megawatt hour of electricity?
That's a really good question. No, I think RECs are traded separately from the megawatt hour of electricity. So your wind turbine generates a megawatt of electricity. Alongside that, it generates the REC. Then you can, if you want, you can keep the REC and retire it for yourself, and then it doesn't transact at any price. Or you can sell it to anyone else. And there are a variety of different markets that these RECs transact in because of people trying to meet their greenhouse gas commitments and that sort of thing. The Illinois RPS, in effect, creates like a new market and a new buyer for these RECs. And part of what we'll be talking about through each of the programs and procurements today is sort of how the prices for those get set, but it's separate from the electricity. It's separate from the megawatt hour of electricity.
So we had another question. Sorry, these just got asked. So how does that requirement dovetail with the new build out of gas?
I'm not sure the
And
context.
Dawn, do you wanna give the context? I think that was a couple little part back.
Sure. So, if there are certain requirements that we get a certain amount of our energy from renewable energy, from wind or solar. And then now we have these gas companies coming in the state, private gas companies and wanting to build. And obviously they are, that they would be contributing to the overall, energy in the state. So, is there anything that the Illinois Power Agency can do to discourage that? The build out of gas and that,
No. No. So notwithstanding, the requirement to the Illinois EPA to ramp down the use of coal and gas in the state through CEJA, the IPA is separate from that, right? And I think the renewables procurements, when you're talking about their procurements that could potentially touch on gas, the only one that there really is energy and capacity procurements. And I think sort of the question becomes, how do you set up those procurements, if at all, because right now they're not set up this way, to consider sourcing and avoid sourcing from gas? Because other than that, there are sort of limited, there's nothing they're doing that sort of touches on gas either way. And I don't think they really have any ability, although I'm open to creative solutions, but off the top of my head to sort of blanket discourage it. And I think that's an interesting conversation, Dawn. It's not one that advocates thus far have found to be especially fruitful. I also think it's probably a conversation for another day.
Okay, thanks.
And that's all that was in the chat. So
thanks. So I put in a time check for myself because otherwise I don't pay attention to it, and we're 25 minutes in, so that's good to know. All right, so that gets us to the RPS programs and procurement. So we have the Illinois Power, just to recap, we have the Illinois Power Agency. They do a bunch of different stuff, including running all of the renewables programs and procurements, and those programs and procurements are dictated or are done in order to implement our renewables policy in Illinois, which is our renewable portfolio standard. And we implement our renewable portfolio standard through buying RECs. So I wanted to start this section where we're actually talking about the programs and procurements by touching on the budget briefly. So first of all these tables that you're seeing screenshot in here, I've pulled out of the IPU's most recent draft plan. And this is a table that they have on their budget. And what it really gets to is sort of the representative budget for 1 year. This is for the first year after CEJA is fully implemented. For these renewables programs and procurements is a little under 600 million. And that's what the IPA has to work with to ultimately get us to 40% by 2030, and then the stretch goal of 50% by 2040. So that's just worth knowing. The budgets come from ratepayers collected through our utilities. And I also want to note that there is some money that's scraped off the top for other programs, including $50 million for a year for the Illinois Solar for All program, which is our low-income solar program here in Illinois. And I wanted to call that out because I want up front, because this right at the start of thinking about the RPS is where the Solar for All program fits in. It's prioritized above other spending. So I'll come back to it because I think explaining how it works is easier after I've explained some of how the other programs work, but right off the top is where we prioritize that. Any questions about budget before I move away from it?
No questions in the chat.
So that brings us to this completely overwhelming flow chart of all the programs and procurements in the RPS, which I'll talk through sort of one by one or in groups. But I wanted to give you the big picture up front, and I'll also highlight that from sort of here on out, what I'll be talking about largely is the new build requirements we highlighted, because that's where we're going to be doing our programs and procurements to get that additionality that we already highlighted as being important. And Dawn, I'm going to try to highlight DEI stuff for each one of these, and if you feel like I'm forgetting it, call me out. So we said a couple slides ago that the new build, we had the new build targets on the right side of your screen, and we said, you know, ultimately the targets require the procurement of 45 million annual recs by 2030. And just to like start with where those 45 million recs come from, the first requirement, like the first step down beyond, hey, get 45 million, and you know, the other requirement in law is to do that ratably, which means do it sort of evenly over time, so you're building up, and I think smoother is better for markets and for budgets and all of the above. So the first requirement beyond that, do that scale up to 45 million recs over time, annual recs over time, is a delineation between wind and solar resources. So 45% of those recs are required to come from wind. And currently that means large utility scale wind farms. And 55% of those recs are required to come from solar. As the IP is proposing to interpret this law, you know, if we were to shoot our new build targets out of the park, then you could sort of 45 and 55 could get somewhat out of balance, as long as a minimum of 45% of those recs required through new build are coming from wind, and a minimum of 55% are coming from solar. Going one step down in the solar, there are a couple of other breakdowns within the solar. One breakdown is for utility scale solar. So like large scale wind farms, we're talking about large scale solar farms. So that's 40% utility scale solar, 50% adjustable block program, which is a mouthful, but means our rooftop solar and our community shared solar, offsite shared solar projects. And then 3%, a small amount for solar on brownfields. And just to bring it back to the new build breakdowns for a second, this is that table I'd shown on the other side, so you can see what those breakdowns correspond to in terms of rec numbers by 2030 for the different categories, for the wind and the solar, and then for each of the subcategories within solar. And if you recall, I said that the 45 million is getting close to, but a little bit below, our 40% of energy from renewables goal. So, you know, the new solar is a little over half of it. So when we're looking at this new solar goal, that means that we're saying, okay, 20%, we're going to build enough solar by 2030 that 20% of our energy in Illinois for the large utilities can be met from solar. And that logic sort of applies as you're going down. That means 10% from rooftop and community, 10% from utility and brownfield, and a little under 20% from wind. So that's how much solar we're talking about and wind we're talking about through these new build requirements. Anyway, going back to the breakdown though, I'm going to talk for a second about the procurements from the utility scale wind, utility scale solar, and brownfield solar categories, because all of these occur in a pretty similar fashion for now anyway. These are the procurements from the IPA for renewables. These are the renewable procurements. They are competitive procurements, meaning that bidders come in, they're saying, okay, I'm going to build a giant solar farm, I'm going to build a giant wind farm, I'm going to build probably a reasonably large brownfield solar project. And they actually, a bunch of groups come in, a bunch of companies come and bid in. The IPA will say, hey, we want this much wind, we want this much solar, we want this much brownfield. And then groups will come in and they'll all bid in a price. They'll say, I can give it to you for $5, I can give it to you for $4, I can give it to you for $15. And ultimately the IPA accepts the lowest cost bids that it can to meet that target it's set at the start. There are also competitive procurements in Illinois also feature what's called confidential benchmarks, which basically means the IPA does some analysis up front to try and make sure that there's a price above which it will not pay for RECs because it doesn't want ratepayers to overpay. So in addition to these bidding processes, feature confidential benchmarks, and ultimately the payment for the RECs occurs when the RECs are delivered. So the IPA, well, the utilities through this deal brokered effectively by the IPA pay for the RECs as the utility scale wind or solar or brownfield solar project is delivering the RECs. There are requirements through new requirements from CEJA that these competitive procurements consider diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and also prioritize projects built in areas eligible for energy transition community grants, which is that ETCG acronym. It was just way too long to fit on this page. So Don, you'd asked what the IP was doing with regards to those. Right now, what they've proposed, they've never done anything in the past. There are requirements for an equity accountability system for jobs to come from equity eligible persons. So there are these requirements for a variety of equity goals in the law. Right now, what the IP is proposing is to sort of have the equity requirements be met or not met, and if they're met, then you are eligible to participate in these procurements. So they're not trying to like incentivize better behavior on that front right now. They're saying there's a minimum threshold which you must meet to be eligible. And I think a lot of how that works is still, there's more to be figured out, and I haven't reviewed all the details and as closely as I'd like to be able to speak off the cuff further to that. They are proposing to prioritize projects built in these energy transition in areas eligible for these energy transition community grants. Mouthful, guys. And they're proposing to do that by saying that they'll just accept all those projects first, assuming that they are bid in low enough to meet the confidential benchmark before considering other projects regardless of price. So that's the other way that they're proposing to deal with that. And I should say that so those areas are areas with retiring electricity generators, retiring coal plants, retiring nuke plants, to try to help bridge the transition for those communities. The last thing I should note is that on the utility scale wind and utility scale solar REC procurements, those procurements are being moved to what's called indexed REC pricing. And now I am going into wonky territory, so I'll try to get out of it in like 10 seconds and just say that those prices are, if you are interested in that, I'm happy to talk about it more. Those REC prices will be floating based off of what those generators can sell their energy for in the broader market. They're basically going to say, hey, IPA, I will sell you this REC at $35 minus whatever I can sell the energy for, so that it ends up being $5 some years, $6 other years, $4 other years. Okay, competitive procurements. Any questions there?
I have one.
Hey, Kim.
Hi. Can you explain, you said RECs are paid at delivery. Can you explain that a little?
Instead, in some of our renewables programs, which I'll explain shortly, all of the value of REC contracts over 15 years is paid up front. That is, and in the competitive procurements, you don't get paid for the RECs until they're generated.
When do they generate? Like, how does that work? When are they generated? Over time?
Yeah, I mean, there's some like quarterly schedule or something that I'm depending on the contract, you have to figure out, like, obviously these are generated like every day and they're not paying them every day or something. But I don't know the details of that. All right. So that brings us to the renewables programs, which are the adjustable block program and the solar for all program, which I'll get to, but let's talk about the adjustable block program for a second. Okay. So the adjustable block program, in contrast to these competitive procurements, first of all, they're for much smaller resources, which I think is important to understand because it's a big reason why these are programs and not procurements. It's for distributed generation, which means generation of energy, i.e., for example, so e.g. solar energy that is distributed across the electricity grid. So lots of smaller projects all over the place instead of one giant generator. In the case of solar and wind, one giant solar or wind farm in one location. And often it's much more difficult for particularly very small projects to like prepare a bid into what is similar to a reverse auction to bid in a REC price. Nobody's going to do that. So I think a key feature of the Illinois renewables programs is set prices. They're also, particularly in the ABP and the adjustable block program, they're sort of set quantities too. They're annual blocks of capacity that the IPA is willing to procure RECs, to buy the RECs from at these set prices. And then they also feature upfront payment in some cases, which we were just sort of talking about with Kim. Some of the categories within the adjustable block program include allow for projects to get paid upfront for their RECs before they're generated. And this can help make a project more lucrative and sort of and make it easier for a project to go forward. So there are 6 different categories within the adjustable block program. I'm going to try to run through them relatively quickly because we just don't have time to like dive into each one of these. But first, there are the small and large DG projects. Okay. DG is distributed generation. We just said that's solar or potentially other generation, but in the case of the adjustable block program, solar, that's all over the grid. So this is generally rooftop solar, and I think often the sorts of projects going through the small DG program are single or small multifamily projects, or also maybe some small businesses. And large DG is sort of much larger projects, Walmart, a school, or previously a school, maybe going forward a school, but Walmart, a government building, a church, that sort of thing. There's a community solar category that's shared offsite solar. I'm assuming that if you're attending this webinar, you have some sense of what community solar is. I'm not going to try to explain that today. There's also a community-driven community solar category. I think when we first implemented a shared offsite solar program in Illinois, there were a lot of communities who looked at community solar and thought, oh, gee, how can this benefit me and my community? How can I organize my own project? How is this going to help bring solar into urban areas? And what we saw with the traditional community solar program is that program has been really successful at getting solar to folks, but largely through developer-driven programs, so organized by a developer rather than a community, largely rural, ex-urban or rural development, so away from some of the urban communities that we're hoping to benefit. And I think what we've seen with this community-driven community solar is program is an effort category, is an effort to try and prioritize some of the community benefits that could come from community solar. There's also now a separate program or category for public schools, as well as a separate category for equity eligible contractors. That is the program intended to ensure that the sort of economic development that comes with the expansion of these solar programs benefits a diverse set of contractors. In the long run, in particular, contractors that are graduating from a wide array of programs that are helping to train up and get the workforce and contractor force ready to participate in these programs. So in the initial year, that's going to be 10% of the adjustable block program, but it scales up over the time, and participants in that category can do any of the other types of solar on this under the adjustable block program. They just get special access to a corner of the program, and as proposed right now, upfront, and they get upfront capital. And as proposed right now, Dawn, to your question, that's the only sort of advantages they get is the special access and upfront capital for doing programs. So this is just a different table breaking down the adjustable block programs, the different categories, the shares of each program, which were also on the previous slide. But you can also see a little bit about the term length. So are you selling your RECs for 15 years or 20 years? About when you get paid, which categories are paid up front, which are paid on delivery, and which are paid sort of spread out over time. And also where prevailing wage is or isn't required. And I'll note it's in addition to not being required on residential buildings, it's also not required for solar developed on houses of worship under 100 kW, which I forgot to put on the slide. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that in general, the adjustable block program is intended and designed to be sort of always open. You know, Mr. Jones wants to put solar on his house. He should be able to go to the small DG program with a developer and participate in it and be able to sell his recs and develop that project. When you get too much more interest in a program than there is space, then these categories will go to something called project selection, where the IPA then has to figure out which is going to go forward. And that's really only happened in the community solar space. The one thing I wanted to call out here is that for community-driven community solar, project selection is actually a feature, not a bug of that system, in terms of trying to prioritize the projects that bring the most community benefit to communities. So time check, I have 10 minutes left to go through Solar for All and the plan.
But I think the chat was going off and I wasn't seeing it. Did you get to how much comes from nuclear, required and or voluntary? This was asked a while ago.
So that is outside of the renewables programs and procurements. And I'm happy to share a webinar that the IPA recently did explaining that, but I think it's a whole, probably separate category of discussion.
Yeah. I wonder, Kim Knowles had asked, I'm sorry, just like chat wasn't going off for me. Kim had a question about, I don't understand when delivery occurs, but this was maybe 10 minutes ago.
I think Kim spoke up, so I think we talked about that. Kim, speak up now if you needed more.
Got it,
No,
great.
that's
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I didn't see heard the question here in the chat, so
yeah,
we're good. I think you can, I don't see any other questions, so I think that you can keep going.
okay. We'll probably will hit the hour mark, folks. And Jen, I'll make sure to share that webinar on that I'm pretty sure is out there on the carbon mitigation credits, or if not, other information that's useful for understanding the carbon mitigation credits, which are used to support zero carbon electricity and nuclear in Illinois. So I said we'd circle back to the Illinois Solar for All program. I wanted to do it after the adjustable block program because it has a lot of the same features as the adjustable block program, and then more. So I think it's useful to sort of layer understanding on that on top of the ABP. So the Illinois Solar for All program is solar specifically for low-income households and environmental justice communities. I already said it's similar to the ABP. It has set prices and annual quantities, just like the adjustable block program does. In the Solar for All program, it's an annual budget rather than an annual rec procurement quantity or a megawatt quantity, but it's very similar. The Solar for All program also incorporates job training requirements. So providing sort of a bridge to the job training that is required under CEJA and was previously required under FEJA. And it also has goals for energy sovereignty. And that's not clearly defined in the law, but I understand it as, you know, low-income households and EJ communities getting full ownership and having full control over their solar energy systems or projects. The other thing I want to note about Illinois Solar for All is that project selection is common, or has historically been common, for a number of the sub-programs, and is typically used to try and prioritize projects that bring more community benefit and more low-income and EJ benefit. So there are 4 different sub-programs under the Illinois Solar for All program. There's one each for single family and really small multifamily housing. and for large multifamily housing. So we can, small residential and large residential have different programs. You know, the way that those types of solar projects work are sort of very different when you're talking about a single family home versus like an 100-unit building. There's also a community solar sub-program that gets the largest allocation of funds. These percentages are all allocations of funds under the program. And that is community solar that serves low-income households with the ability for nonprofit and public facility anchors. And which brings us to the nonprofit and public facility sub-program. So this is like the smallest piece of the program, intended to make sure that the sort of community institutions in environmental justice communities are also getting served by this program. So that's it on Solar for All. Any questions on that before I go to the plan? So you've heard at the start, you heard mention of the IPA's long-term renewable resources procurement plan. That is the plan that guides all these programs and procurements, how they work, when they happen, etc. And that is a plan that the IPA develops and that gets formally approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission every 2 years. So the first draft plan to come about since we passed CEJA was released last Thursday. There's a link to it on this slide. And what that means is over the coming months, there will be opportunities for stakeholder feedback on the plan. So we'll have like a stakeholder feedback process, and then we'll get to a formal litigated process with the Illinois Commerce Commission ultimately having to approve the plan, and potentially, if litigants convince the ICC, require modifications of that plan. So here's a slide on the informal comment process over really the next like 5 weeks is what we have left for stakeholders to submit comments on the plan, and really to recommend as specific changes as you want to the plan. Like they want you to say, if you want something to be different from what they put out in this draft, they want you to say on page 34, you know, don't say that the public schools program is going to have rec prices at $56. Say that it's going to have rec prices at $76 for X, Y, and Z reason. So you don't. They want you to get as specific as you can and telling them exactly what you want to see in this draft plan. Once the informal comment process is done, the IPA sort of digests all the comments over about 3 weeks, and then it formally files its plan with the Illinois Commerce Commission. And that's when we enter the litigation phase, where parties, where folks who care can get a lawyer and legally intervene in these proceedings, and say, hey judge, hey ICC, we think that this IPA plan for renewables should be different for this, and this legal reason, and potentially this, and this policy reason as well. But ultimately, what the ICC is looking at, I think, the most closely is statute, and whether the plan is complying with the statutory goals and you know, achieving the goals set out in statute. And so that will this legal proceeding will take place over a number of months, and ultimately the commission will have until mid-July to approve the plan, and if relevant, if the ICC decides to recommend or require modifications to the plan based on what litigants have suggested. So that's that. We're at 4 minutes for questions, and hopefully you guys got a chance to ask them along the way as we were stopping, so that's okay. But also, here's my contact information. And I also want to note that I can see that we have some very knowledgeable people on this call as well. So if anyone wants to correct anything, I'd also welcome corrections during this time.
Thank you, Melena. Let's give it a minute. You can take yourself off mute or put your question in the chat. We're happy to take a couple more. And then just for folks, as you're thinking about it, our next session is going to be on energy efficiency on February 9th, I believe, with Laura Goldberg from NRDC, Ann McKibben from Elevate, and Nick Dreher from Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. And then we have a series of these going until May on the topics that Clean Jobs Coalition members asked to be covered more in depth. So sign up and you will get more information on how to register for the next ones. But any final questions that folks would like to ask? That was super informative, Melena. Looks like nobody else has any questions. And like I said, we have recorded this, so we will put this on YouTube for you all to share far and wide so people can learn about this process. And I just really greatly want to thank Melena for educating us all. I know I learned a ton. So thank you so much for your advocacy and your brilliance on this subject and for sharing with us. So, all right, I think we're done. 2 minutes early. Any last words, Melena?
No, thank you guys. I hope I didn't bore all of y'all to tears.
Oh no, that was really interesting, really amazing. Have a great afternoon, everybody. We will see you next time.